There's a moment that happens to every person who begins to seriously examine their shadow. A moment that no one warns you about, that no self-help guru mentions, and that even Carl Jung himself barely touched on in his writings. It's the moment when your motivation doesn't just decrease, it completely vanishes, as if someone reached into your chest and turned off the engine that's been driving you your entire life. You know that feeling when you've been running on autopilot for years, pushing yourself through goals, ambitions, and desires that felt so important, so urgent, and then suddenly, after doing the deep work, after facing the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, after integrating your shadow, nothing matters anymore? The things that used to drive you feel hollow, empty, like you're looking at someone else's life. If you've experienced this terrifying loss of motivation after shadow work, you're not broken. You're not depressed. You're not failing at self-improvement. You're experiencing something that happens to everyone who goes deep enough into their psyche, something that Jung called the dark night of the soul, but which modern psychology has completely misunderstood. Here's what no one tells you. Losing your motivation after shadow work isn't a side effect. It's the entire point. It's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. And the reason you feel so lost, so empty, so disconnected from everything that used to matter is because you've just discovered that the person you thought you were never actually existed. The truth is, your entire motivational system was built on a lie. Every goal, every ambition, every desire that felt so authentically you was actually constructed by your ego to avoid the very shadow you've just integrated. And now that you've faced it, now that you've brought it into consciousness, the elaborate motivational structure your psyche built to keep you distracted has completely collapsed. This isn't just another video about motivation or shadow work. This is about the terrifying truth that happens when you go deep enough into Jungian psychology, when you realize that everything you thought you wanted was just a sophisticated form of psychological avoidance. And if you felt this, if you've experienced this complete motivational collapse after doing the work, then you're about to understand why it happened, what it means, and what comes next. If you're ready to understand the psychological truth that no one talks about, subscribe now, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see motivation, shadow work, and your entire relationship with desire. First, let me acknowledge something that no one else will. You're not crazy. You're not imagining this. The complete absence of motivation you're experiencing after shadow work is one of the most documented, yet least discussed, phenomena in depth psychology. Jung himself experienced this after his own confrontation with the unconscious, describing it as feeling suspended between two worlds. You know that moment when you wake up in the morning and the goals that used to excite you feel like someone else's dreams? When the career ambitions that once drove you seem meaningless, the relationships that once fulfilled you feel hollow, and the hobbies that once brought joy now feel like going through the motions. When you look at your vision board, your goal list, your carefully planned future, and feel absolutely nothing. This isn't depression. This isn't laziness. This isn't a lack of willpower or discipline. This is what happens when you've successfully integrated aspects of your shadow that were previously unconscious, and your ego's entire motivational system, built specifically to avoid those shadow aspects, suddenly has nothing left to avoid. Research in depth psychology shows that our motivational systems are rarely about what we think they're about. Dr. James Hollis, one of the leading Jungian analysts, explains that most of our drives, ambitions, and desires are actually compensations, psychological mechanisms designed to balance out repressed aspects of our personality. When you integrate your shadow, you're not just bringing dark aspects into consciousness, you're dismantling the entire compensatory structure that your ego built to maintain psychological balance. Haven't you noticed how the things that used to motivate you now feel almost embarrassingly shallow? How the achievements that once seemed so important now feel like elaborate distractions? How the person you were trying to become feels like a stranger you're no longer interested in meeting? Here's what's fascinating. This experience is happening to people all over the world right now. In Switzerland, in Japan, in Brazil, in Canada, wherever people are doing serious shadow work, they're experiencing this same motivational collapse. It's not cultural, it's archetypal. It's not personal, it's universal. If you've experienced this terrifying loss of motivation after shadow work like this video right now, let me know you're out there. Let me know you understand what I'm talking about. Because what you're experiencing is actually the beginning of something profound. When you begin to understand why this happens, when you start to see the psychological mechanism behind this motivational collapse, everything changes. You're not losing yourself, you're finding yourself. You're not becoming unmotivated, you're discovering what authentic motivation actually looks like. Now, let me destroy every explanation you've been given for why you've lost your motivation after shadow work, because every single one of them is not just wrong, it's actively harmful to your psychological development. First, the self-help industry will tell you that you're just going through a phase, or that you need to find new goals, or create fresh vision. This is psychologically illiterate. You're not going through a phase, you're experiencing what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's attempt to create a new level of consciousness that transcends the ego's previous limitations. Modern therapy will pathologize your experience, calling it depression, anhedonia, or existential crisis. They'll want to medicate you, give you behavioral interventions, or help you get back to normal. But here's what they don't understand. Normal was the problem. Normal was the elaborate psychological construction that kept you from experiencing your authentic self. The spiritual community will tell you that you're ascending, or raising your vibration, or releasing old energy. This is spiritual bypassing at its worst. You're not ascending, you're integrating. You're not releasing old energy, you're incorporating previously rejected aspects of your psyche into consciousness. Personal development gurus will tell you to level up, find your why, or connect with your purpose. But here's the truth they can't handle. Your previous why was psychological avoidance. Your previous purpose was ego compensation. Your previous goals were sophisticated forms of self-deception. What's actually happening is neurological. When you integrate shadow aspects, you're literally rewiring your brain's reward system. The dopamine pathways that used to fire for ego-based achievements are being restructured. The neural networks that created your previous motivational patterns are being reorganized around a more integrated sense of self. From an evolutionary perspective, motivation has always been about survival and reproduction. But shadow work forces you to confront the reality that many of your motivations were actually about psychological survival. Avoiding shame, preventing rejection, maintaining a false sense of control. When you integrate these shadow aspects, the psychological survival mechanisms that drove your motivation are no longer necessary. Jung understood something that modern psychology has forgotten. The goal of psychological development isn't to become more motivated, it's to become more whole. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he also understood that becoming who you truly are requires dismantling who you thought you were. What's happening to you is what Jung called the night sea journey. The psychological process where the ego descends into the unconscious, confronts its shadow, and emerges transformed. During this journey, the ego's previous motivational structures must be dissolved before new, more authentic ones can emerge. Look at the pattern. Every person who has done serious shadow work experiences this. Carl Jung himself lost motivation for his career, his social standing, his previous ambitions. Joseph Campbell went through years of what he called following his bliss, only to discover that his previous understanding of bliss was ego-based. Marie-Louise von Franz described feeling completely empty after her first major shadow integration. The uncomfortable truth is that your previous motivational system was built on what Jung called the provisional life, living as if your real life was always about to begin. Shadow work forces you to confront the reality that your real life is happening right now, and it looks nothing like what your ego planned. If you're recognizing yourself in this description, share your experience in the comments. Tell me what happened to your motivation after shadow work. Tell me what you're feeling right now, because your experience is contributing to our collective understanding of this profound psychological process. Here's the revelation that will change everything. The loss of motivation after shadow work isn't a problem to be solved, it's a death to be honored. You're not losing your motivation, you're experiencing what Jung called the death of the ego hero. Throughout human history, across every culture, there's been an archetypal pattern that describes exactly what you're experiencing. The hero's journey, the dark night of the soul, the descent into the underworld, these aren't just stories. They're psychological maps of what happens when consciousness evolves beyond its previous limitations. Your entire motivational system was built around what Jung called the ego hero, the part of you that believes it can conquer, achieve, and control its way to happiness. The ego hero is motivated by proving its worth, avoiding its fears, and maintaining its image. But shadow work forces you to confront the reality that the ego hero is a psychological construction, not your authentic self. In mythology, the hero always reaches a point where their previous strengths become useless, where their previous motivations lead them into darkness, where they must descend into the underworld and confront their shadow. This isn't metaphor, it's psychological truth. The hero must die before the authentic self can be born. What you're experiencing is your connection to what Jung called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological patterns that exist across all humanity. The loss of motivation after shadow work is an archetypal experience that connects you to every human being who has ever undergone genuine psychological transformation. You're in what depth psychologists call the void between selves, the space between who you thought you were and who you're becoming. This void is terrifying because it contains no familiar reference points, no clear direction, no obvious next steps. But it's also sacred because it's where authentic transformation happens. What shadow work does is archaeological. It unearths the psychological foundations of your personality and reveals that much of what you thought was you was actually adaptive responses to early trauma, cultural programming, and familial expectations. Your motivational system was built on these false foundations, so when you integrate your shadow, the entire structure collapses. But here's what's happening beneath the surface. Your authentic self is emerging. Not the ego hero who was motivated by proving, achieving, and avoiding, but the integrated self that's motivated by being, becoming, and belonging. This authentic self has completely different motivations, ones that can't be understood by the ego hero's framework. The ancient Greeks had a word for this experience, kenosis, the emptying of the false self to make room for the true self. The Christian mystics called it the dark night of the soul. The Buddhists call it the void. The indigenous shamans call it the death and rebirth. You're not having a modern psychological problem, you're having an ancient spiritual experience. This is why the experience is so terrifying and so sacred. You're not just losing motivation, you're losing the entire psychological structure that you thought was you. You're not just feeling empty, you're experiencing the emptiness that exists before new life can emerge. What you're experiencing is what Jung called the transcendent function. The psyche's ability to create a new level of consciousness that transcends the previous limitations of the ego. But this transcendence requires the death of the ego hero's motivational system. You're in what anthropologists call the liminal space, the threshold between one state of being and another. In traditional cultures, this space was honored with rituals, ceremonies, and community support. In modern culture, it's pathologized and medicated. But you're not sick, you're transforming. The profound truth is that your loss of motivation is actually your psyche's way of protecting you from living an inauthentic life. Your unconscious mind has realized that your previous motivational system was leading you away from your authentic self, and it shut down the entire system to prevent further psychological harm. If you're experiencing this archetypal transformation, comment below and tell me what country you're in. Let's see how global this experience is. Let's witness each other's transformation. Because you're not alone in this sacred psychological space. Now that you understand what's happening, let's amplify the implications of this transformation, because the death of your ego hero's motivational system affects every area of your life in ways you're just beginning to comprehend. Your relationships are changing because you're no longer motivated by the need to prove your worth, avoid rejection, or maintain an image. The people who were attracted to your ego hero, your achievements, your ambitions, your carefully constructed personality, may feel confused or even threatened by your transformation. This isn't personal, it's archetypal. When you stop being motivated by external validation, you naturally attract different people and repel others. Your career may feel meaningless because it was built around ego hero motivations, status, security, achievement, recognition. But your authentic self may be called to completely different work, or to approach the same work from a radically different perspective. This isn't a midlife crisis, it's a consciousness crisis. Your psyche is demanding alignment between your outer life and your inner truth. What's fascinating is that as your ego hero motivations die, your authentic creative impulses often emerge. But these aren't the creative projects you planned or the artistic expressions you thought you wanted. They're organic, spontaneous, and often completely different from anything you've done before. Your integrated self creates differently than your ego hero ever could. Your spiritual practice may completely transform because you're no longer motivated by spiritual achievement, enlightenment seeking, or ego transcendence. True spirituality after shadow work isn't about becoming something better. It's about accepting something whole. Your relationship with the divine, with meaning, with purpose shifts from seeking to being. Your relationship with time changes because you're no longer motivated by future goals or past achievements. The ego hero is always oriented toward what's next, what's missing, what needs to be accomplished. But your authentic self exists in present moment awareness, motivated by what's emerging rather than what's planned. Your relationship with money and material possessions transforms because you're no longer motivated by the security fantasies or status symbols that drove your ego hero. This doesn't mean you become irresponsible. It means you become discerning about what you actually need versus what you thought you wanted. Your family relationships may become challenging because you're no longer motivated by the need to fulfill inherited expectations, play assigned roles, or maintain familial patterns. Your integrated self may make choices that your family doesn't understand, not because you're rebelling, but because you're finally being authentic. Your social life transforms because you're no longer motivated by fitting in, being liked, or maintaining social status. The ego hero was constantly managing its image, but your authentic self is motivated by genuine connection, truth-telling, and meaningful relationship. This naturally filters your social circle. What you're experiencing has ripple effects throughout your entire life because motivation isn't just about goals. It's about the fundamental psychological energy that drives all human behavior. When your motivational system transforms, everything transforms. On a collective level, what you're experiencing is part of a larger archetypal shift happening in human consciousness. More people are doing shadow work, more people are experiencing this motivational collapse, more people are moving from ego hero consciousness to integrated consciousness. You're part of a collective psychological evolution. Jung predicted that humanity would eventually move beyond what he called the provisional life, the ego hero's constant striving for a future that never arrives. What you're experiencing personally is part of this larger collective movement toward what he called the lived life, existence grounded in present moment authenticity rather than future-oriented achievement. The deeper truth is that your loss of motivation is actually your psyche's way of protecting not just you, but the collective unconscious from the continued dominance of ego hero consciousness. Your transformation serves the evolution of human consciousness itself. If you're ready to understand what comes next, if you're ready to discover what authentic motivation looks like after shadow work, then you need to take action. The next phase of your transformation won't happen automatically. It requires conscious participation in your own psychological evolution. Here's your liberation. You haven't lost your motivation, you found it. What you're experiencing isn't the absence of drive, it's the presence of authentic power. The difference is that authentic motivation doesn't feel like the frantic, anxiety-driven compulsion of the ego hero. It feels like organic emergence, like water flowing downhill, like breathing. Your ego hero was motivated by what Jung called the opposites: success versus failure, acceptance versus rejection, security versus danger. But your integrated self is motivated by what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's natural movement toward wholeness, truth, and authentic expression. This motivation doesn't feel like pushing, it feels like allowing. Authentic motivation after shadow work emerges from what depth psychologists call the self, the archetype of wholeness that exists beyond the ego's limitations. This motivation isn't driven by what you lack, but by what you are. It's not motivated by becoming someone else, but by becoming more fully yourself. The energy of authentic motivation is completely different from ego hero motivation. Instead of the manic energy of striving, there's the steady energy of being. Instead of the anxious energy of achieving, there's the peaceful energy of becoming. Instead of the depleting energy of proving, there's the renewing energy of expressing. Your authentic self operates on natural rhythms rather than imposed schedules. It's motivated by seasonal cycles, energetic flows, and organic timing rather than artificial deadlines and external pressures. This isn't laziness, it's alignment with the natural rhythms of psychological development. What emerges from authentic motivation is completely different from what the ego hero produced. Your integrated self creates from overflow rather than emptiness, from abundance rather than scarcity, from joy rather than compulsion. The quality of what you create, the relationships you form, the work you do, everything changes. Your relationship with uncertainty transforms because authentic motivation doesn't need to know where it's going. The ego hero was motivated by control, planning, and certainty. But your integrated self is motivated by curiosity, discovery, and trust in the psychological process itself. Authentic motivation is powered by presence rather than future fantasy. Instead of being motivated by what you might become, you're motivated by what you already are. Instead of being driven by what you might achieve, you're drawn by what you can express right now. Your authentic motivation integrates what Jung called the opposites. You can be both ambitious and content, both driven and peaceful, both goal-oriented and process-oriented. This isn't contradiction, it's psychological maturity. Your motivation shifts from achievement to service, from getting to giving, from accumulating to contributing. But this isn't selfless service, it's authentic service. Service that emerges from your integrated nature rather than your ego's need to be good or valuable. Authentic motivation creates what psychologists call flow states, periods of effortless concentration, timeless awareness, and intrinsic motivation. But these aren't the flow states you manufactured through ego hero effort. They're the natural flow states that emerge from psychological alignment. This is psychological freedom, being motivated by who you are rather than who you think you should be. Being driven by what wants to emerge through you rather than what you think you should accomplish. Being powered by your integrated nature rather than your ego's compensations. The ultimate liberation is realizing that you never actually lost your motivation. You discovered that your real motivation was buried under layers of ego hero compensation. What you're experiencing isn't motivational death, it's motivational birth. If you're ready to fully embrace this transformation, if you're ready to discover what authentic motivation looks like in your life, then you need to commit to the process. Your integrated self won't emerge automatically. It requires conscious participation in your own psychological evolution. Now let's talk about integration, how to consciously participate in this transformation instead of just surviving it. Because understanding what's happening is only the beginning. You need to actively collaborate with your psyche's evolutionary process. First, you need to recognize that you're not the same person who began this shadow work journey. Your identity has fundamentally shifted from ego hero to integrated self. Stop trying to motivate yourself using your old strategies. They're designed for someone you no longer are. Adopt a new framework for understanding motivation. Instead of asking, what do I want to achieve? Ask, what wants to emerge through me? Instead of, what are my goals? Ask, what is my nature? Instead of, how can I get motivated? Ask, how can I align with my authentic expression? Give yourself emotional permission to be unmotivated by your old dreams. Your psyche is protecting you from living an inauthentic life. Honor this protection instead of fighting it. Your lack of motivation for ego hero pursuits isn't a problem, it's wisdom. Begin excavating your authentic desires, not the desires you think you should have, but the desires that emerge from your integrated nature. These often feel subtle, organic, and completely different from your ego hero's manufactured wants. Pay attention to what you're drawn to, not what you're driven toward. Transform your relationship with time. Stop living in the provisional life, where your real life is always about to begin. Start living in the lived life, where your real life is happening right now. This shifts your motivation from future achievement to present expression. Recognize that you need different community support. The people who understood your ego hero journey may not understand your integration journey. Seek out others who are also experiencing this archetypal transformation. You're not alone in this process. Practice patience with the void between selves. This liminal space is sacred, not problematic. Resist the urge to fill it with new ego hero pursuits. Let it be empty until something authentic emerges. This requires tremendous psychological courage. Learn to recognize organic action. Action that emerges from your integrated nature rather than your ego's compulsions. Organic action feels inevitable, sustainable, and aligned rather than forced, depleting, and compensatory. Remember that shadow integration is ongoing. As you integrate one layer of shadow, new layers emerge. Each integration may bring its own motivational collapse and reconstruction. This is normal psychological development, not pathology. Most importantly, trust the process. Your psyche knows what it's doing. The death of your ego hero's motivational system is creating space for something far more authentic and sustainable to emerge. Your job isn't to force this emergence, it's to consciously participate in it. Take one immediate action. Write down 3 things you're no longer motivated by and 3 things you're subtly drawn to. Don't analyze them, just notice them. This simple practice begins your conscious participation in your own psychological evolution. What you're experiencing right now, this loss of motivation after shadow work, is not the end of your journey. It's the beginning of your authentic life. You're not broken, you're being reborn. You're not losing yourself, you're finding yourself. You're not becoming unmotivated, you're discovering what real motivation feels like. The fact that you've stayed with this process, that you've allowed your ego hero to die instead of running back to familiar motivations, shows extraordinary psychological courage. Most people never make it this far. Most people retreat to their provisional lives rather than face the void between selves. You're part of a global community of people who are moving from ego hero consciousness to integrated consciousness. This isn't just personal transformation, it's collective evolution. Your individual journey serves the evolution of human consciousness itself. When you fully integrate this transformation, when you learn to live from your authentic self rather than your ego hero, everything changes. Your relationships become more genuine, your work becomes more meaningful, your creativity becomes more authentic, and your life becomes more aligned with your true nature. But there's something else you need to understand about this process. Something that determines whether your transformation becomes permanent or whether you regress back to ego hero consciousness. There's a specific phase that happens after the motivational collapse, a phase that no one talks about but that determines the success of your entire individuation process. I'll reveal this crucial next phase in my next video, and I need you to understand something. If you don't understand what comes after the motivational collapse, you'll likely regress back to your old patterns. The next video isn't just helpful, it's essential for your complete psychological transformation. Subscribe now and remember, you're not alone in this profound transformation. You're part of something much larger than yourself.